Welcome to another of my videos about Gamebooks. It is a magical time to be alive, to be witnessing the renaissance in board gaming, that we're seeing the huge renaissance in board gaming, and that not as huge but considerable renaissance in the gamebook format, something that many of us loved back in the day, and now we are seeing new editions of those old books and new game books are being written. How amazing is that? What I have here is Destiny's Roll Zero to Hero by Mark Lane. You may know this gentleman the way that I know him, which is through the internet. He's very active online in discussions about game books, especially fighting fantasy. I see his comments, his contributions about fighting fantasy books especially, and definitely fighting fantasy seems to be an inspiration behind Zero to Hero. And as I understand here, Destiny's Roll is going to be the title of a series of game books, and Zero to Hero the title of this specific one. As you can see here, in fact, this appears to be the issue 0 of the Destiny's Roll line. And it is also a peculiar game book in that it is a sampler. It is not a single story, as I frankly expected, for some reason, just because most books that come out and they are marketed as game books have one story. It is a sampler with 4 stories, with four works of interactive fiction, and they are in different genres. You have Master of the Tiltyard, which is a fantasy, and it takes place during a tournament, a joust. Fragile Beauty, which is a hard-boiled fiction, mystery fiction. And then we have The Cult of the Black Feather, which is a fantasy, and it seems definitely inspired by fighting fantasy, especially Livingstone's treasure hunt to collect a bazillion items because you'll need them to complete the adventure style of fighting fantasy books. And then we have Celtic Frost, which is an unusual book. It's a story kind of like belongs to an unusual genre, but we'll talk about that. Of these 4 stories, 3 have game mechanics, which is the first 3. Celtic Frost doesn't. It is a purely narrative story. And the mechanics have things in common, and again, they seem to be inspired by fighting fantasy. They're very approachable. They definitely are entry level in terms of complexity. If you never played a game book before, you won't have any problem. If you played the game books, so from Lone Wolf, Fighting Fantasy, Will of the Tiger, then also you won't have any problem whatsoever. I don't know in what sense this collection of 4 stories is exactly a sampler or an introduction to the later entries in the Destiny's Roll line, because I don't know, it means that some of these stories are going to be expanded to like a full book, or simply they represent the genres that will be represented. It's unclear. Mark, if you are watching, why don't you leave a comment and let us know? I'd like to know that. Now, talking about these stories, Master of the Tiltyard is a joust generator. It is a pretty short story. It's about 50 paragraphs, 50 sections, and a lot of them are combat. Pretty much, there is a very basic system that represents normal combat, like on foot, normal melee, and actually then jousting. It's a variant of melee combat in which you can make a couple of specific decisions about things that may happen as you are rushing your horse against an opponent, and your opponent is doing the same, and you're trying to unhorse each other. It is very simple, it is very linear, and it is really built like a tournament. You defeat an enemy, good for you, and then something happens, some basic events between different sections of the tournament, and then pretty much you are asked by the text, whom did you defeat and whom did you not defeat yet, and that brings you to the next opponent. So it is extremely linear. I didn't find that there were many relevant decisions to be made. There were several sections, or most of the sections really, that pretty much were on autopilot. You win against an opponent, you make a decision or two, and you are then sent to the next opponent. Combat seems to be the main element of the story here. And we have that is not unprecedented. There are tunnels and trolls books, beloved solo adventures such as Arena of Kazan that are also arena tournament generators where combat is the main thing. However, for those to be successful, then you need to have a good range of tactical options. The problem that I have with Master of the Tiltyard is that it's all about combat, and combat is fairly autopilot-ish, is very linear, doesn't have a lot of depth. Yes, it's about spending some resources, you spend them later, you spend them now, make a decision here, make a decision there. But I don't feel that the combat is tactical enough, it's rich enough to be enough to support an entire adventure. And outside of combat, Master of the Tiltyard really does not have much. So I have to say, it left me a little bit lukewarm. Fragile Beauty it's a hard-boiled mystery, structurally reminded me of the Sherlock Holmes game books, if you know those, in which you have a story, you make decisions, but then sooner or later you reach a point in which pretty much you need to demonstrate that you solved the case, otherwise you fail the adventure. In a sense, it's also reminded me of Appointment with Death, a classic fighting fantasy, in which also you have a strong sense of passage of time. There are certain game books which are more about exploring the space, and sometimes you can go back and you just have what matters is where you go. But then also there are other game books that have a much clearer temporal scansion. This is the end of the day, now you start the second day, there are only so many things that you can do before necessarily the end of the second day arrives, and so on and so forth, until time runs out and either you're ready to solve the situation or you aren't. So and I like that. I think it works very well, especially for mystery, for the mystery genre. The problem that I had with this is not in the structure. The structure was fine. The mystery was challenging. It just had all of the right elements of a nice little puzzle. What I didn't like all that much was the writing as related to the genre. There were some elements of hard-boiled scattered here and there, especially at the opening. You had the arrival of the femme fatale to your office where you're the detective. Fine, you're right there with Marlowe, with Sam Spade, but then the story turns into a fairly generic mystery. You don't have a sense of space, a sense of a community, a sense of the city, where it's happening exactly. You don't have that atmospheric, evocative, immersive style, which is such a strong element of hardboiled. I like old school hardboiled fiction very much. I read a lot of that fiction. I even teach about it in a class that I teach at IU about mystery fiction. There's a section when we read The Big Sleep and we talk about the genre. And just reading the descriptions in hardboiled is as much fun as following the plot. I just didn't have that sense of immersion in the parallel reality of the hardboiled through the prose that I expect from hardboiled. I didn't have it here. I don't know if the author thought that was an important element, but what happens here is that we have a contemporary mystery, again, something that if you're reading hardboiled, I prefer to see the 30s and the 40s. It can be neo hardboiled, but it just felt like it was a fairly general modern mystery with some hard-boiled references here and there, but structurally it was fine. I just found the prose, the descriptions, the atmosphere a little blender than I would have liked, and that also I expect from hardboiled. Cult of the Black Feather, a fighting fantasy story in 250 some paragraphs instead of the classic 400. But other than that, it is fighting fantasy. I like the premise very much. I'm not a fan of how the premise turns into the main story, but then the main story is just as fun as a fighting fantasy, a slightly shorter one. What is the premise? The premise is original. In a lot of game books, the hero is a young, trained, but untried hero. In the old Endless Quest series, that was just the standard. You're a teenager, your parents were kidnapped or killed, or you found yourself lost, you were sent on a mission, it was your first adventure, and that of course was a trick to create identification with the ideal reader that at the time was indeed a teenager. That that was the kind of person that the books were written for, were marketed to. I like that now the author seems to be aware, almost like a meta thing, of the fact that there are also readers that are not teenagers anymore, that we're coming back to the form. And I like the fact that the hero is an adult one, explicitly so, and not old, but, you know, towards the silver fox age, maybe 50, 50-something, or in any case, a hero that has seen enough adventure and murder and death that this hero, apparently a warrior, that's kind of like the sense that they get, wants to retire. And so you start, so that's a very fun premise, a very new premise to me. And so you have heard that there is this temple in which you may cleanse your soul of all of the sins that you committed, of all of the bad stuff, all the looting and probably murdering that you did. I like that we are acknowledging that when we play game books, sometimes you're just going on killing sprees that wouldn't really be all that copacetic in our world. Anyways, the hero wants to retire, goes to this temple, and as luck would have it, he, or she, I guess, finds out that the temple has now been inhabited, not by the old peaceful monks that you were expecting, but by an evil cult of death, of deadly cultists. It is your classic demonic cult that worships really bad entities. And here is where the premise that I liked turns into an adventure that is fine, but I didn't like how the transition is handled, because basically you're exploring this temple. You're approaching the temple, I guess no one told you, never stopped at an inn, you didn't meet anybody that told you, wait a second, by the way, did you know that that temple now is run by a group of mad maniacs? No one seemed to have noticed. As you enter the temple, you start noticing people attack you, there are monsters, like what is that weird animal doing there? The problem to me is that the transition is not acknowledged and the story is handled like a traditional fighting fantasy in which, in fact, you're going out and killing animals and killing enemies and collecting monsters and searching everything, etc., etc. You enter a room towards the beginning. Remember, your character went there to retire, to find spiritual enlightenment, and you're asked, do you want to search the room? Of course I want to search the room, because this is clearly a fighting fantasy style game. I want to look for items that I will need later. So immediately the options that you're given and the prose in the book turn you into an adventurer that is actively seeking the truth about the temple and figuring out how to defeat the cult, the cultists, and whatever evil entity they worship. It's unexplained why. Why, when the hero realized that that was not the place that the hero expected, why the hero embarks on this adventure is not explained, is not acknowledged nearly at any level that would make sense, and you basically start playing as if at the opening section you have been told you have been sent, you have been hired by the local lord, or you are an adventurer and you want to kill the cultists to get their treasure. So it's just a traditional thing which you feel like is very goal-oriented, but then the goal is not even really explained. So there was a period there where, of course, I was playing as if I was exploring the dungeon of Zagor in Warlock of Fight of Mountain, but I didn't really know why my character was doing that. There seems to be a disconnection between the character and the narrative potential, the innovative narrative potential of the willing to retire hero, and then what the options are and what the obvious strategy is. The obvious strategy is look everywhere, try to collect as many clues as possible. The choice is between, do you want to open the door or press on? Is there ever anybody that pressed on? Of course I want to look into the door, because I know that later I'll be asked, do you have the bone with the runes, and you have that items, and you learn that number that is connected with that other thing? Of course I want to explore everything. And so my guy that was looking for spiritual enlightenment and did not know about the cultists, and now he's exploring every corner of the dungeon, because then the adventure is basically a dungeon crawler. Every corner of the dungeon to figure out the items that will be needed. Towards the end, there is a very intense sequence of tests. You have this, you have that, there's that door, you should know what to do, there's that thing, do you know how to behave here? Which are all things based on clues that you have before. Easy peasy, you have at least 10, 12 items or pieces of information that you need to find and provide towards the end to make it. Otherwise, you get into one of those instant death situations. That's a lot. That's why in the introduction I talked about a young Livingstone-esque type of adventure. But with 250 sections instead of 400, and the story is like not linear, but it's like a stream. It's not sprawling. It doesn't feel like it really goes in a million different directions. It doesn't feel like a maze. It feels like there is one main tunnel, one main path with different diverging areas for different outcomes based on what you do in the diverging areas, which ones you visit, which will be all of them, obviously. So it's a lot of items and pieces of information, but it's not nearly as impossible as in some of Ian Livingstone's books. It is a good challenge. It is a good challenge. My complaint again is like the hero feels even less motivated and believable than a fighting fantasy hero, which is to say something, because we are not looking for, you know, like Henry James or for a deep psychological portrait, but just the hero feels very, I don't know, out of focus somehow. And the dungeon is fine, it's perfectly fine, it's a fun romp, but it also feels very generic. It's not like we haven't had a lot of dungeons such as this one in the last 30 years or so. We have one more that we hadn't tried yet, but other than that, I don't feel that there is much of innovation anywhere. Again, you read every dungeon crawler out there, you read every fighting fantasy a million times. Well, here there is another dungeon for you to have some fun. It's fun, it's fine. It wasn't remarkable or innovative in any other way. Very classic, almost like an homage to fighting fantasy, with a weaker protagonist, weaker in the narrative sense rather than muscular sense. Celtic Frost, the last story in the collection, also the shortest one, and the most original, the most inventive. First, it's interesting that the paragraphs are labeled by letters, so from A to Z rather than numbers, so you know how short it is. And the genre, it really feels like a text adventure on paper. Text adventure, by I mean the digital text adventures like the ones that we had from Infocom, especially in the 80s. A lot of independent ones are being written now. Another renaissance, the renaissance of the digital text adventure. And in those adventures, there is a disproportionate number of situations that open with you being confused and disoriented and being uncertain about who you are, sometimes even where you are, what are you doing. So this adventure, you wake up and you discover that you're dreaming, or you wake up and you're not who you are. You walk out of the fog, you're not sure where you are. These situations which are confusing, you have to figure out the world and who you are and what's your role in the story as you go. 905, it's a classic digital text adventure, modern classic, but it's a perfect example of this, that you wake up and you're doing things and you're a little bit confused. I'm not going to tell you anything else actually about Celtic Frost because it's really fun. I really enjoyed it, and so I don't want to give you any spoilers. There is this situation in which you have to figure out what the heck you're doing and you should be doing to get to the optimal outcome. What I liked, well, first, there is a mystery at the core of this, and the mystery really is not that hard to figure out. Early on, I was like, oh, I think this is what this is about. I will not give you any spoilers about that. Yet, even when you figure out the generic thing, there are a couple of moments, two interesting moments, in which you do have to do some lateral thinking to figure out where to go next. And I found those very delightful. They take advantage of an element of the structure that I did not expect to be called into question, to be activated, to be turned into an element of the story, and that's it. That's what I had to say. What I feel like saying, because I don't want to spoil you the surprise. So overall, Destiny's Roll Zero to Hero, it's an okay collection. It's an okay collection to start with. Maybe that's me. I prefer longer works. I have fun reading Choose Your Own Adventures that are all shorter than you know the main stories here. But when I get game mechanics and I want 350 paragraphs on a lone wolf, I want 400. I just want more of an epic sense, and that's just who I am. I discovered reading this book that I don't prefer short fiction when it comes to game books. But as for the execution, again, at least 3 of them are okay, but there is something flawed in there. And clearly the author knows very well the conventions of the genre and also to structure a branching tree. That is done very well. It's just in the writing itself, in the craftsmanship of the text that I find things to be a little lacking. Master of the Tiltyard is the one that actually, to me, has a little bit of a structural problem, not because it doesn't work, but because it doesn't give you a lot of interesting choices. They're all based in combat. In combat, you don't have much to do. It doesn't feel all that interactive, is what I'm trying to say. Fragile Beauty and Cult of the Black Feather, they are fine as challenges, as puzzles, as adventures, not as compelling to me as texts. Again, we're talking about the fabric of the text, the characters, the atmosphere, the setting, etc., etc. Fine as structures, as textual structures, and I like the fact that they do give us 2 sides of the same coin. That is the temporal-oriented story with the mystery, where really you get the sense that the clock is ticking in Fragile Beauty, and the space-oriented one, and the space or the exploration-based one in Cult of the Black Feather. Celtic Frost, maybe my favorite, but in any case, a little gem, really fun. I found myself smiling at the end when I realized what the lateral thinking was. I enjoyed that. Of all of these, probably Celtic Frost and Cult of the Black Feather are definitely my favorite ones. I would say actually kind of like it goes in crescendo from really to better and better. I guess it's good. I guess then I get that sense of climax. Cult of the Black Feather, enjoyable, if not super original. Celtic Frost, short, little delightful puzzle. The other 2 stories, okay, but not all that much. So I'm curious now to see how the series develops. This, as I see, I'm a little bit lukewarm between pluses and minuses. I didn't hate it. I was fairly entertained. I didn't fall in love with the book, but well, I guess that's my general assessment of Destiny's Roll Zero to Hero. And well, let's see where the series goes from here.